Vulkan is the best Primarch that ever Primarched, and it has taken me a long time to come around to that, but that's where I stand. This demigod son of the Emperor of mankind's perpetuality is often seen as his most defining characteristic, but there's so much more to the Lord of Drakes than just his immortal status. In all of Warhammer 40K lore, Vulkan is the best-natured, the kindest, the purest of heart, the physically strongest, and he cannot die. And that's just the beginning of the list of things that set this Primarch apart, miles apart, from his brothers. If there ever was a son of the Emperor that could be called a good man, it was Vulkan, the Primarch whose heart bleeds for humanity, and who would sacrifice himself and his legion to do the right thing by the citizens of the Imperium. His honor, courage, and discipline are far beyond impeachable, and his sense of duty to humanity is one of the most human characteristics that Games Workshop ever bestowed upon a Primarch. And sure, Vulkan has a dark side, and he can do the most evil, vile, and despicable things, just as any of the Emperor's generals. But with the Primarch of the 18th Legion of the Adeptus Astartes, the Salamanders, we see a nobility that is beyond reproach and a loyalty that cannot be questioned, because it cannot fail, nor even falter. The Emperor found Vulkan on a world that pretty much sucked, Nocturne, but the Lord of Drakes was making the best of it, being an awesome blacksmith and beating the crap out of Dark Eldar raiders who were taking advantage of his people. The usual Emperor meeting one of his lost sons shenanigans ensued, and the Emperor was kind of playing down who he was, just pretending to be some dude from space or whatever. So they competed to see who was more swole, and they hunted the wild great lizards of Nocturne known as Salamanders. The whole thing reads like a folk tale, a legend or myth, kind of gave me Paul Bunyan or John Henry vibes. And that's what it should be. The Emperor reuniting with his demigod son should definitely be folklore level, shrouded in myth and legend, but possibly containing a sliver of truth that made it through the millennia. But if we take it literally then, well, you get my point. So the Emperor saved Vulkan by throwing his giant space lizard into the lava to save them both. By default, Vulkan won the contest, but he still took a knee in front of the Emperor as it was revealed who he was. It was all symbolic and whatever. But we see that selflessness that defines Vulkan on full display by his father, who bequeathed that aspect upon his son. So the Primarch is reunited with his usually psychotic, but currently acting in a rather stand-up way, Space Father, the Emperor of Mankind, and he's given the 18th Legion, as he's the 18th Primarch. And that legion was appropriately named the Dragon Warriors, but then they changed it to the Salamanders in honor of the giant space lava lizards of Nocturne in the meeting of the Emperor and Vulkan. So everyone thinks that Vulkan is awesome, and his sons totally respect him, but they're a truly wild and super ferocious bunch. Like, they literally took 80% casualties just because they didn't know to stop fighting. They won, but almost all of them died. So they were a committed lot, and the Primarch taught them new ways to fight, including self-preservation techniques such as not dying endlessly to achieve nothing, and getting out of the way of enemy fire. And such novel ideas as taking care not to cause civilian casualties and compassion for the regular humans, which were extremely progressive values for their time. Vulkan truly believed that all lives matter. Well, at least human lives. But Vulkan spent a long time with the Emperor, many years in fact, before being reunited with his legion. And he had newer Marines that came from Nocturne, not from Terra. But when he met his sons who were out crusading in the name of the Emperor while he was getting caught up on all the goings-on of the galaxy outside of his little bubble of Nocturne, Vulkan knelt before his sons, not allowing them to kneel before him. He was like, "Thanks for being out there kicking all that ass so that we could all be chilling and enjoying life safely," basically saying, "Thanks for your service." But it was really interesting that when the Terran-born Marines went to Nocturne, they started to turn really dark like the other Salamanders and the Primarch. Something within their gene seed made it happen. But it's awesome. It protects them from all the harmful rays of Nocturne's sun, and it makes them look like warp demons with unnaturally black skin and red eyes. They look totally awesome, like something out of a horror movie. And yet they're the nicest Marines out there. But even though Vulkan is completely the nicest Primarch, and even though he taught his legion that protecting the innocent was the right thing to do, and that they were the shield that protects the Imperium, It was their duty to protect the weak. Even though all that, he's still a cold-blooded killer, general of legions at heart, and he did just that one time, just that once, do something just a little amoral, just a little bit. Yeah, I'm talking about when he burned that Eldar child alive. It scarred him, and he thought he had no other choice, really. It was a moral conundrum, after all, and a very emotional response to losing someone he generally loved and seeing her broken body lying dead, done in by the Drukhari. So Vulkan can get real grimdark if he needs to. And despite how awesome he is, if something was in the way of him getting his job done, or doing his duty, then he wouldn't be deterred by it. But yeah, he felt really bad about it later. But most of his brothers would tell him not to even waste a moment thinking about a filthy Xenos, child or not. Then again, it can be said that without the Eldari, several times throughout the lore, the Imperium of Man would not have endured. But that is a topic for another video, it sounds like. So Vulkan is all crusade-y and taking the fight to the galaxy. His legion is a little replenished, and he's doing pretty good out there. He got a later start than many of his brothers, but he's conquering systems and bringing them into compliance in the name of his father, the Emperor of Mankind, and he's out there doing his best, being the best he can be, and he's still an artist at heart, which is something I really love about Vulkan. Perturabo and Ferrus Manus get all the recognition for being awesome smiths, but Vulkan was literally the smith of all smiths, and Vulkan crafted the baddest hammer ever, rivaling even Forgebreaker. This hammer is called Dawnbringer, and Vulkan uses it to smash tons of enemies. The hammer is said to be indestructible, but after using it for a while, the Primarch intended to gift it to his brother Horus. It was supposed to be a symbol of his recognition of his brother's rank and status as War Master, but Vulkan felt that there was something off with Horus, something really messed up, like his vibe was totally off. Yeah, Vulkan was a very empathic dude, so when he felt his brother was off, he knew he was right about it. Horus teamed Vulkan up with Curze and the Night Lords, and the Salamanders' Primarch should have known that he couldn't change Curze, but he tried. The seeds of enmity were sown, and Curze rejected Vulkan's methods. And Vulkan, well, he was absolutely disgusted with how the Night Lords used terror tactics. So yeah, Vulkan had honor and he hated terrorism. So of course he wasn't going to get along with Conrad Curze. But one thing that I think about Vulkan that you'll probably never hear anyone else say is that Vulkan was an absolute 100% bona fide heretic. He wrote a lot and mixed ancient Terran mysticism and spiritual practices with the culture and lifestyle of Nocturne and came up with his own cult, basically. He implemented the belief system he advocated into his legion, and the Salamanders all became members of the Promethean Cult. And to me, the Prometheans, while wildly considered an acceptable variant of the Imperial Cult by the Ecclesiarchy in the modern setting of Warhammer 40K, well, they were full-blown heretics in 30K. The Imperial truth was the only truth acceptable in that time, during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. The Imperium was hardcore atheist, and Vulkan's belief system incorporated several heretical beliefs. The soul, for example, was held to be true and actually exists by the Prometheans. But there are scholars who believe that the Salamanders were not tempted to join Chaos due to the Promethean Cult for multiple reasons. First, since the entirety of the Salamanders' legion were in the cult together, the warrior lodges that corrupted the traitor legions from within did not take root in the Salamanders. They already had their own warrior culture with its own mythos. And second, the Salamanders already had a spiritual belief system. They didn't need to join any chaos cult. They were already in the Promethean cult. No need to join Heaven's Gate if you're already a Scientologist, So yeah, to me, Vulkan was running around conquering worlds for the Emperor and his atheist empire while secretly indoctrinating his sons into his cult. Let's check out what their creed is. The Promethean Creed. Ours is a violent calling, but as adherents of the Promethean Creed, we believe in the circle of fire. None can come back as they once were, but in death we are returned to the ash from whence we came to be born anew, our blood and bone bonded with the earth. Through fire are our enemies made Protean. Through fire and the reunion with earth do we experience rebirth. After death, after our duty is ended, we give ourselves to these elements and in so doing become a part of them. This is the nature, the circle of fire. And they have all sorts of little sayings and mantras they use constantly, reminding themselves to keep their heads in the indoctrination game. Without wisdom, skill cannot be focused. Without skill, strength cannot be brought to bear. Without strength, wisdom cannot be applied. From the teachings of the Promethean Cult. But despite being a heretic on the down low, preaching his weirdo pseudo-religious creed, Vulkan was one awesome Primarch. And Horus betraying the entirety of humanity came down really hard on Vulkan and the Salamanders. At Istvan V, the dropsite massacre happened, and the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, and the Iron Hands were nearly all but erased entirely. Ferrus Manus got decapitated, and Corvus Corax barely made it out alive. And Vulkan, well, he got straight up nuked by the Iron Warriors. And that is how he, and we, found out that Vulkan was a perpetual. Now, if you read the original lore on this, the old Horus Heresy Black books, then you look at Book 2, Massacre, you'll see that it describes this scene and states that only 5 Marines in total escaped. 5? I mean, in that original lore, it was stated that there were only like 30,000 combatants between both sides, loyalist and traitor, but that nearly comprised all of several entire legions. But yeah, really glad they updated that 5 guys escaped into at least 5,000 Raven Guard or so alone. I mean, if I remember correctly, that was 4 Salamanders and 1 lone Raven Guard who escaped Istvan V with their lives in the original lore. But Vulkan got nuked, and his sons were mostly obliterated. And yeah, he found himself facing off against the Iron Warriors and Night Lords. And they killed him. At least, he thought they did. They stabbed him up a bunch and shot him and beat him to unconsciousness. Curze took Vulkan prisoner, and he, being the total psycho he is, tortured Vulkan endlessly. When he went to kill his brother, Vulkan just regenerated, no matter what the Night Haunter did. And there was some pretty grim stuff. He decapitated Vulkan, of course. He tore his brother limb from limb. He put him into space naked, put him in the engine of a starship and burned him up. I mean, Curze got creative and even used a fork on his brother. But Vulkan just wouldn't break, and Curze was going crazy trying to kill him and endlessly failing. By this time, it was obvious to both Primarchs that the Emperor had bestowed upon his 18th son the greatest of abilities. Perpetuality. Curze cannot break Vulkan, not at all. He tries psychological torture. He tries endless games where Vulkan has to exert himself physically and mentally for as long as he can, holding off the inevitable, which usually ended with the death of innocence. But Vulkan just wouldn't break. He was completely indestructible of will and body both. But Curze did some really gnarly stuff, and yet Vulkan was as stubborn as an anvil. So Curze decides to have some fun with Vulkan and teach him a lesson. He puts Vulkan in a labyrinth that was designed by Perturabo, and hidden in the labyrinth was Vulkan's hammer, Dawnbringer. He keeps hunting Vulkan throughout the maze and killing him and just playing mind games, basically being Curze at his worst, and Vulkan finally finds Dawnbringer, and he's stoked. When he'd made the hammer, he'd put a teleport homer in the handle, and was thinking that he'd activate that and travel right to his ship and away from Curze. But Curze knew it was there and had deactivated it. The whole maze, the labyrinth, had been a game. And Vulkan gave Curze one of the greatest dressing downs of all time. He totally destroyed any notion of Curze being on the level of the other Primarchs. He straight up lets Conrad know that he's a bitch, and gets Dawnbringer. And he tells Curze that he knew the whole time that the Night Haunter's ego would make him have to face Vulkan one last time. And then he lets Curze know that it's cool if the teleport is broken because he's forgetting one thing. Curze asks what, and then Vulkan delivers one of the greatest one-liners in 40K. It's also a hammer. And if you've watched some of my other videos, then you'll know I absolutely love one-liners, especially ones that are just dripping with testosterone and action hero level badassery. But yeah, Vulkan's reply is definitely up there with Solomon Akura telling Karn the Betrayer, "I am Alpharius and I am your death." It's a straight up balls of steel moment. Then Vulkan beats the absolute crap out of Curze with Dawnbringer. I mean, it is kind of hard to imagine that kind of beatdown, and it came with that berating, hyper-focused, righteous indignation that only Vulkan could bring. I mean, then in the most alpha move ever, Vulkan won't even dignify Curze enough to end his life. He leaves him just shattered, absolutely smashed, and is like, "You aren't worthy of killing, scum." I mean, Vulkan says the meanest things a brother can say. He let Curze know that his upbringing and what he'd been through weren't the cause of his delusions and insanity, and let him know that he was the gimpiest Primarch by far, just by the odds. One of them was likely to be flawed. Vulkan told Curze that he himself was made the physically strongest by the Emperor, and let Curze know that he was the only Primarch that the Emperor gave no boons to. It was brutally harsh for sure, and before the beating even commenced, to the man who is fear himself, Vulkan stated that none of his brothers fear him. They all laugh at him. They all pity him. This was probably the single meanest thing Vulkan did to Curze. As he kept screaming about how he's the Night Haunter and he's fear itself, I literally imagined a juggalo putting on his face paint and telling his brother that he only goes by Night Haunter now, and Vulkan just looks at him and just can't take him seriously and then puts him in a headlock. But the beatdown, it was like Ralphie versus Scott Farkas. I mean, it was bad, and Curze deserved it for sure. I can't say that Vulkan didn't do a little bullying, but after what Curze put him through and the countless physical deaths, some of which were really extreme, Conrad Curze did deserve anything and everything he got. So Vulkan emerged victorious over his brother, and he was then aware of his perpetuality, but he was still a Promethean, and in my eyes, a heretic. But he only let his brother live because Curze was trying to prove to Vulkan that he was right and they were both equally immoral. I mean, this guy was always on a death trip trying to prove something to someone. But when Vulkan then is able to activate his teleporter, he teleports to Macragge and falls from the upper atmosphere and burns up on the way in. When the Ultramarines find his charred remains, they didn't recognize him. They thought that a statue had fallen from space. He was so burned up and unrecognizable. But eventually he rejuvenated, and he was crazy when he came to. Totally insane, trying to attack anyone and everyone. And Guilliman was not happy. Eventually Vulkan raids the armory and goes after Curze, who was actually on Macragge because the Dark Angels had captured him. And he escaped their flagship using a drop pod to get to the planet's surface. So round 2 of Curze versus Vulkan was on Guilliman's home turf no less. They fought like two raging gods, smashing their way through an entire city. And by this time, Vulkan was well aware of his perpetuality, so he basically just tried to focus on that, and he found that when he really concentrated, he could regenerate much faster. Still didn't stop Curze from blowing Vulkan's head off, but the cool thing was that Vulkan's body fell off a cliff and his head regenerated before he hit the ground. He was getting that good at it. But this is where things go south for the Promethean. John Grammaticus shows up on the orders of those shady fools he worked for, the Cabal. You know, the Xenos cult that is obsessed with Horus winning the war. They first showed up in Legion and corrupted the Alpha Legion, or did they? And Grammaticus thinks he's going to give a Fulgurite spear to Conrad Curze so he can use it to permanently kill Vulkan. But Eldred Ulthrin of Craftworld Ulthway, probably the greatest and strongest Farseer that the Eldari have ever produced, contacted Grammaticus and told him to use the Fulgurite on Vulkan himself. And he stated that doing so would kill Vulkan and Grammaticus both, allowing John to finally die. And it did sort of work. John Grammaticus stabbed Vulkan and there was an explosion and they both died, but John regenerated as he always did. But when he came back, he knew it was his last life and there would be no more continues. Vulkan didn't recover though. So he was sealed in a sarcophagus that Guilliman made, and it said Unbound Flame on it. Very touching, Guilliman really showing that he's a solid bro. I know a lot of the Primarchs didn't like him much, but he sure did show that he loved Vulkan, and I think he honored him pretty well. But Vulkan had way more to do, so of course eventually he woke up. He was taken to Nocturne by the Salamanders and resurrected in a blood sacrifice ritual where the Salamanders' cult beliefs of the Promethean persuasion came into play in a real way. The first captain, Artilus Numian, sacrificed himself to resurrect his Primarch. And it worked. The Salamanders were down to around 700 to 800 total legionnaires, and they were all in attendance at Vulkan's funeral. The Promethean Cult rites were performed and the whole chapter was branded, and they lowered Vulkan's body into magma and Mount Deathfire. Yes, it is literally Mount Deathfire, which is actually totally badass and also kind of straight out of a parody. But Vulkan still had the blade of the Fulgurite spear in his chest, as nobody could physically remove it. The Promethean cult leader basically was like the main chaplain, told the first company captain, Numian, to take over the leadership and be the new head of the Salamanders Legion. But he refused, saying Vulkan was the only one who could lead them back into the war. And nothing had happened. Now, they went through a lot to get Vulkan's body back to Nocturne. And that deserves its own separate video. But the Salamanders faced traitors on the way, and Artilus was asked by Magnus the Red what he would sacrifice to see his Primarch reborn. As Artilus was thinking upon this, he realized the answer was not that he would sacrifice anything and everything most willingly to bring Vulkan back, but that he had to sacrifice everything, meaning his life. So he wandered out into the wasteland and threw himself down a lava shaft into the magma. His homies went out searching and didn't find him, but after days of looking they thought they finally did. Except when they got closer, they found that it was Vulkan, disoriented and weak with a spear still sticking out of his chest. Now the reason that the spear had been able to kill him was it was Fulgurite, which in 40K means it is a shard of the Emperor's psychic abilities frozen into a solid state, a literal psychic bolt that can end Primarchs. But Vulkan was back, like Prometheus from mythology. He did resurrect, and like Prometheus, he suffered. An endless cycle of it, actually. Nobody had probably suffered as bad as Vulkan in the entirety of the setting, but Vulkan's suffering was only just about to begin. He's going to crank it up to 11 million, because the Lord of Drakes has to get back to Terra, and that was not a fun journey. So the 3 Marines who found Vulkan were told not to reveal his return to his legion, which I think was lame, but they got named the Drax Ward, and their names are Atticabidemy? Sorry. Their names are Atticabidemy, Barakxitos, and Eigengargo. And oh my god, that was so hard to say. Salamanders seem to have some pretty weird names, which is cool, I guess. But yeah, Vulkan, when he resurrected, but before his Drax Ward found him, was deep inside Mount Deathfire. And Sauron was forging the Ring of Power and just seeing if you're still paying attention. But Vulkan is totally disoriented, basically walking around in a dreamlike fugue. And he meets this old man who calls himself Deathfire. And he tells Vulkan that he really should travel to Terra to see the Emperor. But then he shows Vulkan to 2 artifacts, claiming that Vulkan had forged them, even though the Primarch had no memory of it. Everyone thought he was dead, but he was just in the heart of Mount Doom, a volcano, and was forging away. So the items in question are the awesome and amazing warhammer called Heretical and the Talisman of 7 Hammers. And Vulkan is able to use the talisman to open a Webway portal deep within Nocturne. Anyway, he and his homies, the Drax Ward, bounce to head out to Terra. But mad fools front on them, and they end up fighting Dark Eldar and Kamara before making their way through the Webway and getting to Shadrach Medusan of the Iron Hands' fleet. And this is something I covered in my recent video about the most grimdark moments in Warhammer 40K. And this one's up there. But it turns out the Salamanders aren't the only loyalist Space Marine Legion that is secretly fronting for a cult. But instead of the Prometheans, which, let's be honest, cult or not, in opposition to the Imperial truth or not, their weirdo cult beliefs work. Vulkan did resurrect. Or did he? Maybe he was fine the whole time and was just down there forging. But the Iron Hands, yes, they have the cult of the Gorgon, And these fools were tripping. I mean, straight up on some whacked out trip where they thought they were resurrecting their dead Primarch Ferrus Manus. And when Vulkan was introduced to what Medusan was calling Ferrus, he saw one of his dead brother's necrodermis-covered arms attached to an automaton body, seemingly controlled by a heretical AI. But I mean, Vulkan was pissed. Being presented with such an abomination and told it was his dead brother whose life was lost on Istvan. And just as a side note, because I have to get this out, but why is it that when we think of legions or chapters that hate the Iron Warriors, we think Imperial Fists? But they literally nuked the Salamanders out of existence. Just saying, Salamanders might not hold a grudge, but they also don't stand for whack, janky tripe like a dead Primarch's arm duct taped to a servitor being called the resurrection of Ferrus Manus. If you're going to join a cult, avoid the Gorgons with every fiber of your being. You're better off in Scientology or even the OTO than that. But yeah, Vulkan, he treated the abomination before him to a nice hammering as if it were Conrad Curze. It was completely destroyed. Even the arm of Ferrus that was attached, which was thought to be completely indestructible. But the hammer, your Dracula, obliterated it. Vulkan and his boys left, telling the Iron Hands that they were tripping and that they were broken, and basically he felt sorry for them, more or less. He refused to take part in Medusan's war, even though they were fighting the Sons of Horus. I probably would too. Golas are offensive, and the Ferrus Manus one, that's really scummy. But this is exactly why I don't like the Iron Hands as much as the other legions. They're by far my least favorite legion, and it's because of this and their undead zombie space marines who are borderline servitors, basically their army of Robocops, that I find I don't love them as much. When I say that a certain faction's fans always get butthurt, but even when I go out of my way to say that I love all the legions, just I love the 10th the least, I'd tell these people they're not only in a cult, but the wrong cult. So Vulkan and the Drax Ward bounce and get on their way back to Terra, and on the way they meet up with some Eldar who are working for Eldred Ulthrin, and they help Vulkan get into the Webway and go towards Terra. Vulkan finds himself going from Caldera, where he met the Eldar, to the Webway and into the impossible city, Kalistar. A very special place in the Warhammer 40K lore, and I promise you will be featuring heavily going forward over the next few years. In the impossible city, he fights demons, and comes face to face with a great unclean one, Aglbor. And usually a greater demon of Nurgle is an insane opponent, and it was, but the Talisman of Seven Hammers isn't just a talisman. It is a WMD, and with it Vulkan slew Aglbor. Not just physically, but within the warp as well. To demons, who are usually completely immortal and exist outside of space and time, this is known as true death, and they are completely obliterated. Still, the Primarch and the Drax Ward were harried by demons to the point of being overwhelmed. But then the old man, Deathfire, shows up and reveals that he's Eldred Ulthrin, and he tells Vulkan the Emperor has sealed the portal to the Imperial dungeon. So he opens a new portal and transports Vulkan to the gates of the Imperial Palace. So he got a ride all the way home, after a few minor run-ins. Nothing he couldn't handle. Rogaldorn was happy to see his brother, but the Custodes came and got Vulkan and said the Emperor wanted to see him. And they took Vulkan to the Emperor on the Golden Throne. The Emperor told him the talisman could destroy all of Terra, and he had to be the man to hold it because he was basically the most patient and reluctant to use his powers of all the Primarchs. Vulkan was the only one who could be trusted to hold the trigger to the last resort WMD that would take everyone out and deny Terra to chaos. The Emperor let Vulkan know that not only was he expected, but his arrival and entire journey to Terra had been being looked over by the Emperor from the throne, and that Vulkan was compelled to create the Dracula, I can't even say it right, Dracul and Talisman of Seven Hammers by the Emperor's will. Vulkan's entire purpose was revealed. His whole life came down to being the man to activate the Dead Man's Switch, the Talisman of Seven Hammers, during the final battle, should the Loyalists lose. Vulkan installed the device into the Golden Throne and went to man the Eternity Gate. But Vulkan had another fight at him before the siege of Terra was over, and when Magnus the Red and his sorcerers entered the Imperial Palace to assassinate the Emperor, it was Vulkan who stepped forward to block Magnus's blade with his super hammer. They exchanged some words, and Magnus tries to manipulate Vulkan. Then the Emperor offers Magnus redemption, because he knew he failed his son and caused a lot of strife and turmoil because of some mishandling of certain information. But along with this, there's a balancing of the scales and the fact that in order to gain this redemption, Magnus must be cool with his entire legion being destroyed, as the mutation of their gene seed was too much and the flesh change couldn't be cured. Magnus refused, and Vulkan agreed that if he were in Magnus's place, he would refuse as well. But still, he defended the Emperor against the Red Cyclops and gave him a mega beatdown. At this point, call me a sadist or whatever you want, but I kind of get off on Vulkan clobbering other Primarchs with big hammers. During the fight, because Magnus was the only Primarch who could come close to rivaling Vulkan in strength, and that was mostly due to him being able to appear as whatever size he needed to be, Magnus didn't just go down like a bitch. He would have pierced Vulkan with a deadly strike, but Barak Zytos sacrificed himself to take the blow. This sent Vulkan into a rage, seeing his son cut down like that. So he takes up Zytos' Thunder Hammer and dual wields hammers at Magnus and just unleashes. I mean, as physically strong as Magnus is, or psychically strong as Magnus is, he couldn't do anything about it, really. Vulkan was a volcano of hammers erupting all over Magnus. But before Vulkan delivers the killing blow, Magnus accepts chaos, turning to Tzeentch and becoming his thrall. Magnus was immediately expelled from the Imperial Palace by the wards in place that repelled demons, and he had become a demon Primarch. And that saved his life, as Vulkan didn't get to smash him with you are Dracula. That's what I'm calling it from now on. The Eternity Gate is besieged by the traitor forces, and Malkador lets Vulkan know that Magnus has gone into the Webway and is enacting a ritual to sap the Emperor's energy away, stealing what strength remained in him. He'd been on the Golden Throne for a long time by this point. If I recall correctly, about a decade or more. So Vulkan goes into the Webway and back to the Impossible City, and there he meets the demon Primarch of Tzeentch, Magnus the Red, who had been taunting and goading Vulkan on his entire journey through the Webway. If you're a fan of cosmic horror, then the Impossible City is basically Carcosa. Then they had another fight, and this one was epic. At first, Magnus is hiding back and doing his ritual while a smoke version of him is fighting Vulkan. But Vulkan eventually gets the upper hand and interrupts Magnus's ritual. Magnus was forced to fight him and kill him, and Magnus did it over and over again. He beheaded Vulkan, and that didn't work. He turned the Lord of Drake's lungs into amber, drowning him, and many, many other very interesting deaths. But Vulkan came back every time, forcing Magnus to reconsider just what he was doing and how he was doing it. So, unable to defeat Vulkan, Magnus telepathically projects into his mind as his old self, noble and heroic, and he tries to explain everything, but he might as well have been Alfarius trying to explain himself to Dorn. Vulkan wasn't hearing any of it. He told Magnus off, letting him know that if he wasn't a heretic sorcerer, then he wouldn't have ended up a slave to chaos. Everything Vulkan said was true. But outside Vulkan's mind, in the Webway, Vulkan was standing over Magnus, ready to deliver the killing blow, and the Emperor's voice was telling Vulkan to slay his brother. But he stole his hand, and he did not bash Magnus to death, which allowed Magnus to cast a spell that obliterated Vulkan, disintegrating him on the atomic level. But before he fell to dust completely, Vulkan smashed his hammer down on Magnus and exploded him, sending him back to the warp to reform in time. Vulkan was able to walk away from that. He regenerated, despite Magnus's best efforts to give Vulkan a true death and end him forever. And the Emperor is leaving for the Vengeful Spirit with Sanguinius and Valdor and Dorn and the Custodes as Vulkan is returning. And I honestly think that sending Vulkan up against Horus would have worked a lot better than Sanguinius. But yeah, Vulkan was ordered to guard the Golden Throne in Malcador as he sat upon it in the Emperor's stead. And if the traitors were to breach the throne room, to activate the Talisman of Seven Hammers and destroy all of Terra, denying Horus the homeworld of mankind. Then, Big E and his posse go off to face Horus. And the traitor forces on Terra get to the point where they are about to cross that line. So Vulkan, he starts to activate the talisman. Malcador knows that hope is not yet lost, but he's totally frying like bacon in the microwave sitting on the Golden Throne, and he can't even talk. So he's watching in horror, basically, as Vulkan is activating the ultimate doomsday device. And then Octe's voice is broadcast across Terra, and it tells everyone that all hope is not yet lost, and the Emperor still lived and was battling on against Horus. So Vulkan, it turned out, was the right man for the job. The traitor Horus Lupercal is defeated, and the traitor legions on Terra turn tail and run. Vulkan's patience and strength proved the right tools to be used after all, where the Talisman of Seven Hammers was concerned. But then Dorn and Valdor show back up with the shattered body of the Emperor, and Vulkan is there as his father is interred upon the Golden Throne, never to move again. But then again, Warhammer 40K is turning 40 really soon. Anyway, Vulkan didn't really want his legion to have to adhere to the Codex Astartes that Guilliman came up with, and for good reason. He didn't even have 1,000 guys left. The Salamanders didn't need to be broken down into chapters. But still, he waged war on the traitors, and especially took offense to the Emperor's children because of the atrocities they inflicted upon the people of Terra. He went on a rampage against them. But then, he just up and walked away. Just like his brother Leman Russ, he walked away from being the leader of the Salamanders, and nobody saw him for 1,500 years. At least, that is officially recorded in Imperial records. But 1,500 years after the Emperor was put on the throne and he hunted down traitors during the Scouring, Vulkan reappeared during the War of the Beast. Vulkan returned to Caldera, and he was fighting an entire orc by himself, just regenerating every time they killed him and fighting an entire horde. It was insane. But then word gets to the Inquisition, and Inquisitor Corland goes and tries to recruit Vulkan for a task he needs help with. Vulkan says he'll do it, but first needs help killing the orcs on Caldera because he'd sworn he'd never see it on fire again the last time he was there. So he'd sworn some oath that he probably took him way too seriously because he's indoctrinated into his own cult, which again I personally see as heresy despite everything. But hey, we all have our own opinions, and I respect if you feel differently. Corland helps Vulkan and then takes him to Terra, where he takes over the Imperium for a while. But then they go to Ulanor and have the intention of slaying the greatest war boss ever, known as the Beast. And this dude is like 10 meters tall. He's huge, and he can totally speak Gothic. He's way smarter than the usual orc, and honestly, when I look at the Beast, I think it looks like the Krork's trying to come back. Like, he's finally a fully cooked orc. But yeah, as orcs get bigger, they get smarter and stronger both. And the Beast was as bad as they've ever come. In my opinion, he makes Gazkul look like Makari. But the war was massive, and the orcs had even set up a capital city and named it Gorkhagrad, which is hilarious. But it all came down to when Vulkan faced off against the Beast in a Gargant turned temple to Gorkan Mork. Vulkan tackled the Beast after he said the orcs were going to wipe out the humans and be our end. They fell into the power generator, and Vulkan became filled to the brim with raw energy, and instead of dying like anyone else would, he channeled it into his hammer, Doom Trimmer, and let loose on the Beast's face like a nuclear blast. It was insane, and it exploded the entire Gargant, and ostensibly, Vulkan and the Beast were both destroyed in the blast. Vulkan has not been seen since, though there are clues he's out there, waiting until his sons are worthy enough for him to return, and they're looking for the artifacts of Vulkan, for he's prophesied to return when they are all found. But then again, the Salamanders are all indoctrinated into the Promethean Cult, so of course they're going to be hung up on some religious mumbo-jumbo like that.